Hello, everyone, and welcome to another episode of the Security Repo Podcast. In this episode, we're going to be diving further into the world of API security. Now, of course, if you're a regular listener to this podcast, you'll know we talk a lot about application security and other areas of cybersecurity. And you may be thinking, isn't API security just part of application security? And in many regards, it does fit under that umbrella. But APIs are so important in the role that they play in modern application that API security is really deserving of its own classification or category in security. And so that's what we're going to be diving into this week. Now, we have a fantastic guest joining us to talk about this. We're joined by Isabelle Mauny, who's the co-founder and CTO of 42 Crunch. She's a very established person in this field. She's authored multiple books. She's a regular presenter at some of the top tier conferences around the world. And most importantly, she's been working on API technology for the better part of 2 decades. Isabelle spent most of her career working in IBM in various different technological roles. She's also contained many high status titles, including the Vice President of Product Strategy in WSO2. But in 2016, she went on to co-found the company 42 Crunch, which we'll hear all about, but is helping keep APIs transparent and secure. So without further ado, here's our conversation with Isabelle Mauny on API security.
Thanks for being here, Isabelle. We met back at API World and AI Dev World, turns out, the same show. And there you talked about API security. And one of my big takeaways is if you're worried about application security, that's great, but that's not going to cover all the bases with API security. Just quick high level, like what is the big difference? Why isn't API security and app security the exact same thing?
Great question. That's how we got started with the company as well. It's like looking at app security and why it was different. Essentially because, what's an API? Well, an API is something people write so that they can expose data and processes which are internal to their company to, it could be internally, it could be to partners, it could be externally. But essentially what it deals with is you make me a call, whichever way it is, and I'm going to return to you some data, right? And what is specific about API security is really how do we protect that data? And the architecture of applications. So you still build applications with APIs, obviously. So you could say that API security is a subset of the overall application security space, right? But what has changed is, when I started working, when you were writing an application, what would you do? You would create something, pretty much everything server side, right? You would write some code. That code would render some UI of some sort, maybe JavaScript, maybe HTML, maybe whatever it was. And then you would just send this to a client, and that client would just render that data, right? And so the entry point to your application was really what this browser or mobile app would actually go and connect to. And the control of that data, the control of the access was all server side, right? And I think where we see the big difference between traditional application security and API security is that all layer of control and management of the data, which used to be server side, now somehow is ended up being client side. Because in the end, if you do an application which is API based, what the backend does is just, call my API, I will give you some data, more or less rich. And you consume that data in your very smart applications. Applications are getting smarter and smarter client side as well. And I will render it for you, right? But if I go around that application and I go straight to the API itself, then I get the raw data. And the whole trick about API security is how do I protect that raw data from leaking to people that shouldn't get it? How do I protect people that come with the token and say, hey, this is me, I want to access that data? How do we prevent that? So it comes with its own challenges in how we access the data, how do we authorize the access to the data, and how do we filter and control the data which is being returned back to the client. That's the main big difference for me between traditional AppSec and just pure API security as well.
bypassing the traditional application is really becoming almost the first step now in attacks. And one of the biggest security flaws when we're talking about API security is came from Australia. Last year, where there was a big telecom company called Optus, and they had all their customer sensitive data just at a public facing API, and kind of the biggest thing is sequential customer numbers. So, customer number one, the next one's number two. And so once this was discovered, the attackers got all that information, and the app could have been as secure as possible, but the API had been completely missed. And in that case, it was, well, pretty catastrophic.
It was very catastrophic for Australia that year. that those 2-3 weeks around Optus were pretty complicated for Australia. A lot of stuff happened in that very short amount of time. And there's just one thing that I hear a lot from a lot of people is the notion of what is a public API. And there's a huge misconception here that people think, well, I didn't tell anyone about my API, so it's not public. Right? I'm not advertising it in any portal. I have not told anyone they could come and consume it. So then it's private. It's mine. It's like, well, no. The thing is, the minute you put something on the internet, it is public. So as that's the source of so many problems, because it's kind of security by obscurity, because I'm not talking about it. Then nobody will know. But it's so easy, and anyone here listening, if you want to try this, it works every single time. Just open, Hello World on any public cloud and watch, I don't know, whatever, 5-10 minutes later, maybe 1 hour if you're lucky, you will start having those bots hitting you and trying to discover what that public endpoint is all about. Because it's all automated, and all those IP addresses are in public domain. It's very easy to do. So nothing is private the minute it's on the internet. That's the key, one of the key things. It's not so much public versus private, it's more closed versus open. But the minute it's on, minute on the internet, that's it.
Yeah, that's something we end up talking about a lot on the code security side. We make honey tokens as one of our products in our platform. And every time we give this talk, and Mac, you can back me up on this, every time we talk about this, people are like, well, what's the real danger? Like how fast or how often do people actually go looking for these things? And you have to explain, it's not an individual sitting down and thinking, okay, where are these APIs? It is bots constantly mapping the internet. I heard a number, and I don't know if it's accurate. We can edit this out, but the Shodan can look for every new port every 4 minutes. So it is constantly looking for any port it can possibly find in the whole internet. So the reality is not, I didn't advertise this so no one's going to know. Like you just said, it's very much the bots. So
there's no human army of humans capable of finding those things manually, but there's an army of bots finding those automatically. So that's one of the key issues here, indeed.
One thing that I'm always curious is how people end up kind of working in this field. So how did you get involved in kind of API security? Did you come from a background of more, let's call them more traditional security approaches, maybe AppSec or area, or is this something that you really saw there was a need for and wanted to get involved in more specifically?
So actually, I'm not coming from the security world. I'm coming from the API world. I've actually been, I used to work for IBM when IBM started the first API management, API gateways back in almost 20 years ago now, when they acquired Data Power. And so my thing is more integration and APIs. And what I saw, though, when I was working on this, originally API management was all about governance more than security. It's really about having a place where you would, advertise again internally and have a catalog of all the available APIs. Otherwise, well, the whole thing is how we're going to find them if we don't have a place that tells us what exists, right? And of course, adding authentication on top of the APIs and some rate limiting, etc. But API management has never been created to be a pure security solution in the AppSec sense of the term. And it's kind of funny. We saw pretty much, maybe 3 years or years in people starting to install API management at large companies and stuff. We're starting to see questions in RFPs popping up saying, by the way, what do you do about threat protection? Right. And everybody was like, okay. So let's say that's when you look at a lot of the API managements, you will see that they have some kind of web application firewall in front of them, in general fueled by mod security, because that was like the fastest way to get some threat protection in front of APIs. And it's really where I got interested in this, and where we saw the limits of, well, again, of web application firewalls in the world of pure APIs, because again, it's not the same thing and it's not the same security. So it came from there. It came from working with so many customers. That's where I met my two other co-founders as well. And then we said, there's something we need to do about this. And that's how we started the company. Also seeing the, I would say, the critical role that developers have to play in all of this. And this is a big topic of discussion probably for this podcast, but what has been traditionally something, owned by application security teams, and just say, well, we're on a corner, we deal with this, and then developers on the other corner doing their applications. That, that whole, I would say, culture and how we work together is different. I think it needs to be different in the world of APIs, because developers have a huge role to play in how how to protect APIs, because it all starts at design time. It's too late if you get that production and suddenly you tell the AppSec guys, hey, time to secure those things. It's a bit like what you guys are doing, right? It's too late if you discover the day before production that, oh, damn it, we have secrets leaking for all over the place. What are we going to do? So yeah, it's a bit of the mix of, being in the API world, seeing the limits of the current AppSec solutions, and the will to blend and help developers become much better at security, at API security in particular.
Yeah, for sure. The world in the days of it's behind a firewall, security's taken care of. Those days ended a long time ago. I don't know if that were ever
were they ever there, Dwayne?
there was a time, I got a gray beard. There was a time when it's like, it's actually, you can't get to our SOAP, internal microservices communication in Java, unless you know how to get to that physical server. There was a time in the early days of the internet. I'm not defending WAF, but we need WAF. We still need WAF. But you mentioned Crunch 42 there. Well, you didn't actually mention it by name, but you are co-founder of 42 Crunch. Curious to how that name came about. Like, where did that name come from?
Well, the first part, you guys, or you've been there for a long time. The answer is 42. You know that, right? That's an easy one. Hitchhiker's Guide to the Galaxy, the universal answer to any problem, is 42. So that's where the 42 is coming from. The crunch, so it's like there's couple legends around it. One is one too many Guinness into an Irish bar, and trying to find a name that would fit to say we want to crunch problems. And the other one is actually nicer, I think, from a legend point of view, which is Captain Crunch, which is a very famous hacker that was known. So we kind of put these two things together. That's where 42 Crunch came from.
Yeah, one of the first phone freaks, or the most famous of the phone freaks, could whistle into a phone at the exact frequency and make it think, "Hey, someone's put a quarter in," and give you free time. That's a fascinating story. Yeah, so those of you who are in the audience that have never read that story, that's some fascinating rabbit hole to fall down. Phone freaks with a PH. For some reason, in security and hacking, anything that pronounced with an F got turned into PH, and this has always been the case. So it's not just this isn't a new phenomenon. This has been around for years. I did want to ask you about 42 Crunch's mission, but specifically around the tools that you make available, because you do make a number of free tools available to the community. Could you just go just a quick high level on what you're making available out there?
Absolutely. Actually, this very new stuff as well. It happened last week, so this is perfect timing. So what do we do? First of all, so as I was mentioning before, one of the key things we want to do is really to enable developers to very quickly and as early as possible find potential issues in their APIs. For the simple reason that if we wait too long to find those in the life cycle, the more we wait, the more complicated it's going to be and costly to actually fix those problems if we find them as well. So one of the things we do is we create two tools. So we have an engine which allows you to do both, I would say, static and dynamic analysis of your APIs, but we feed ourselves from what we call an API contract. That is the definition, not the code. We don't look at the code. We're totally agnostic of the code itself, but we look at OpenAPI, aka Swagger type files that describe what the API actually does. So if you take something like OpenAPI, this is a traditional thing that, like, again, any API management solution would support to describe in a standard way across the board. Hey, it's my API, that's what it does. This is a set of paths, a set of verbs that you can use. This is the data in, this is the data out, and you can describe that data as much as you want, right? So the tools that we provide for developers, and they're available in multiple IDEs like VS Code, IntelliJ, Eclipse, is to allow you to do what we call an audit, which is like a static analysis of those open API files. And the key important thing here is data. Back to our first point and why APIs are different, right? If everybody in their code was validating that the data they receive is actually what they expect, a lot of problems will not have happened. So we basically just tell people, hey, we're looking at your API definition here. It seems like this definition there is very loose. Like, you're just telling us, or you don't tell us anything about the input coming in, which is perfectly valid from an open API's perspective, right? It just says, well, there will be some data coming in. You'll see what it is. And same thing the other way around. There will be some data coming out. You at least have to define a 200, but you don't even need to say what that 200 is going to return in terms of a data structure. So we'll just give like instant feedback to developers saying, hey, you can do better here. You can give me some more information there. Are you sure you didn't forget, what happens if, you may have a 401 if there is an authorization problem, or 403, or if data is wrong, there should be a 400. So we help them refine that definition and get something which is, first of all, of higher quality in general. Like, if you take that file now, you put it into an API management catalog, the rendered documentation would be much better than it was, but also attract their attention on all the potential security problems. And this you can do by just writing that open API file that we don't need even code to do any of this, right? So you can do this at a click of your, of your IDE. You can go to any of those marketplaces. You search for 42 Currents, you're going to find this. So we give an open API editor and linter, etc., plus that audit functionality. And now, and I will do the same thing also from an implementation point of view. We'll say, hey, you told me now through the contract, you told me this is the contract, this is what my API does, right? That's what we tell others, what the API is actually doing. So now we're going to go and validate that, right? We're going to look at the implementation and make sure that indeed, if I'm doing some request, the response that I get are the ones you described with the right data that you described, right? And to do that, we do two things. We do like a baseline of good data to make sure that you get the good answers. And then we'll just hammer basically the API with all kind of bad stuff, right? The data formats you don't expect, the data types you don't expect, path you should not have, what happens if I don't put a token, what happens if I put an expired token. So we'll just generate automatically all those different, what I call hacky tests, as opposed to happy tests, right? We'll just generate those hacky tests automatically from that open API definition and run those against your API from the comfort of your IDE, right? So that allows you to very quickly and early in the life cycle, as a developer, our goal is basically have those tests become part of the everyday life of the developers, make it so easy that basically it's just one click and you get the details. You can do this in your corner, nobody will know. And then when you have a good score and a good thing, you can take that code and you can push it into CI/CD now, right? So that stuff is basically available to all in the freemium mode. So you can run this, try all of it for a number of calls per month. So this is what we've basically announced last week. So we have now this new freemium mode across audit and the scan. And as part also as an agreement we just we have with Microsoft, which Align announced last week, and an integration with their products. But it's it's basically what we do. Our goal in life is making sure that no vulnerability we could have found from a design and testing point of view in the IDE goes past the QA phase. Basically, that's the key thing.
That's such an important comment to make too, though, because there's a friction between developers and security, and often that friction happens because by the time the developers hearing about the security issues, they've moved on to 4 different things. They've put it through the pipeline. It's running. It's ended up on the security person's desk, and they're not even really involved in that process anymore. But having it appear at the initial stages, making it integral at part of their workflow, relieves so much of that friction that we have, and then all of a sudden, everyone talks about DevSecOps, bringing development into security, but how do you actually implement that? Well, you give them tools that fit in with their workflow that allows them to be part of that. So I mean, that's such an important thing. It's really cool approach that you've taken.
Indeed, and it's quite a different way of it's not only I would say our goal is to enable this from a technical point of view, because I strongly believe that if you, as you said, like if those tools don't fit and blend in the everyday flow, pretty much they're going to be rejected, because it's like another stop again in my work path. I don't have time for stops because I'm under pressure, and as you said, like I'm done with feature 1, 2, 3. I'm on 156 already, right? And I don't even remember what 1, 2, 3 was all about, because it entered dev like 2 months ago, right? And it's very late, and I don't have to do this. So the whole but it's also, and I'm sure you guys are seeing this as well, it's a cultural change. There's a lot of customers we're talking to that say, well, we'll just, I was just on a call with somebody a couple of days ago, and they were telling me, well, do you have an export PDF button so I can send that PDF to the developers? And I'm like, no, well, that's not the way. If you want them to be friends with you, you don't send them a PDF at the end of the flow. How they're going to reproduce a problem with a PDF? That doesn't work, guys. That's why we have all those tools, but people need to think. It's a different way of thinking and working. So it's also changing the way those two groups are interacting with each other. But I think we have to do it. So like when you talk to people, say, yeah, it really makes sense. It's like, yeah, because those developers, by the time you send them report 1, they've made 5 changes on that API already. So your report anyway is obsolete already, right? It goes so fast. The developers, they go so fast. And okay, let's not get started talking about AI, but it does have an impact, because we're giving those means to developers to be so fast now, even faster with all this help. So those development cycles, they're only going to do one thing, is accelerate. It's going to go faster and faster and release faster and faster. So the automation and DevSecOps, no brainer. You have to put this in place, and you have to start early. Otherwise, there will always be this, like they're on time warps, right? They're in completely different time cycles, which are not fitting into each other, right? The developers, they're here, with the AppSec guys, they're still testing version 1, and those guys are already at version 3. So yeah, it's going to take time. It's going to take you guys to push it. And it's an industry thing, right? It's not only about the tools again. It's about advocating for that change of culture and way of doing things that we all have to push, I think.
I'm briefly interrupting this episode to talk about the security repo's sponsor, GitGuardian. GitGuardian is a code security platform that specializes in detecting secrets in your development workflows and also in your code repositories. Not only can GitGuardian bring to the surface all of those leaked secrets from way back in the history in your projects, but it can also let you know when systems have been breached by using their brand new Honey Token module. Honey Tokens are fake credentials that you can put in your environments and also in your third-party tools to know when they've been compromised. GitGuardian is free for all teams with less than 25 developers. You can sign up today at gitguardian.com. All right, back to the episode.
If you could get developers to read 90 plus page PDF documents, they would just be security experts already. And then, they would already know all of this stuff. But yeah, that's what I keep hearing pushback against shift left, because I think we interpreted that wrong for the most part in the industry. And developers like, here, just figure out security now. Now this is on your plate. Versus here's the tooling and here's the training and here's process wise why this needs to happen earlier so we can move faster. Because developers want to move fast. And I think if we enable them to move fast with the right tooling in the right place, then it's going to be interpreted right. Then it will be accepted, embraced. I don't think any developer wants their API to expose data to the wrong person. I don't think anyone wants
Exactly.
to be insecure.
The same way no developer wants to write code that has bugs, but that's life, right? But if the earlier they discover them, the better, because it's gonna come back it's gonna come back to bite them anyway, because nobody else is gonna fix this. The only people who can fix those problems, whatever they are, like security vulnerabilities, are just another type of bug. It's going to come right back to them, hopefully, and before this thing goes in production, which is really what I'm hearing a lot from some customers, is just crossing fingers and saying, well, yeah, we know we had to deploy this thing, and then we'll go and see how we can fix what has been found way too late, to allow us to convince business to delay the release of that application, and that's the real problem. So it is, it's a no-brainer. I think we all agree. But again, to a key point you just said here, Dwayne, it's shift left. It's not about saying to the developers, "Oh, you've been responsible for so many things. There's one more you're responsible of, and that's security now." With the tools we've always been using for security, which is the other thing. Like, those tools are not adapted to developers. Very few are, right? And we're back to bending the flow and everything. I used to have this guy who told me, like, let's not mix shift left with shove left.
I love that.
Which is like pushing everything that was on the right, all the left, pushing really strong, and shove it in the face of the developers. Like, it's a bit colloquial, but that illustrates the point, I think, pretty well.
I'm stealing that. And that is the next presentation I do. That is going to be in there. That's amazing.
Go for it. I'll tell Scott.
To get a little bit back on track back to APIs, because we could talk forever about the larger scale of developer focused security. But one of the things I know that you've talked a lot about in different presentations and different areas is the OWASP API top 10. I think a lot of our audience will probably be familiar with generally the OWASP top 10. But could you maybe give an overview of, like, what is the API top 10, and how could a developer or security people use that to try and improve or understand API security better?
Absolutely. Well, so same foundation, which is the OWASP, who's at the core of this. What happened really is, in not the last, but the before last update of the OWASP top 10, like the generic AppSec one, the original plan was to have number 10 being APIs, right? And then other people said, no, that doesn't make sense, because it's not like there is one big problem apart from OWASP top 10, which is APIs. So this is where the idea came. It's like, we need our own top 10 for API security. Back to our original point that APIs are different, right? So what is the API security top 10? It's basically revolves around three main things. The first one, you talked about it, which is API 1, top of the list, right? Is what happened at Optus. this thing about sequential IDs and which is basically people will have heard about this before as something like IDOR, right? And in the API top 10, it's been renamed to BOLA. So if you hear about BOLA, which is Broken Object Level Access, right? BOLA is all about that. It's about Isabelle having a token. I have full access to an API, no problem at all. Totally authorized to access even that operation. Let's say get account details, right? But I can do get account details on my account. I cannot do get account details on Mackenzie accounts, right? And the only difference between the two is indeed my account is represented by an ID, maybe this 123 we were talking about before. So it doesn't take much to think, what if instead of putting 123, I was putting 124, right? And obviously, if you have sequential IDs, which are so easy to iterate over, right? And there is nothing to stop you. As I always say about the OWASP top 10, it's never one problem in isolation. It's always going to be a combination of things. So if all the big breaches that have happened where BOLA is at the heart of it, because there's definitely an authorization problem, which is when that call gets on the back end, it needs to say, Isabelle, 123, that's fine. Isabelle 456, oh no, she doesn't own that thing, she doesn't have access to it, right? But it's a pure, and this is, I really insist on this because there's so much confusion in the market right now, people trying to all steer their way on how to fix this issue. The only way you're going to fix this is by doing a real authorization system that takes the identity of whoever is calling, that takes the resource and says yes, no, right? You can mitigate BOLA by doing some other things. For example, in the top 10, you have rate limiting and resource limiting, right? It's kind of obvious, like if somebody is writing a little engine that iterates 1, 2, 3, 1, 2, 4, blah, 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 right? If they do this 1,000 times, 10 million times, and nothing stops them in their track, like rate limiting, the effect of that breach is going to be 100 times higher than if after 10 calls, something says, whoa, what's happening here? Like that same token is calling that same main point now 10 times in a row, right? And it really shouldn't be this way. And so if you, on top of that, you add a problem of authentication. So you have a public API that you said, well, nobody's going to find it. So it has no API key, no token, no whatever. So now you have what I call the boom effect, right? So you have no authentication, no rate limiting, and an authorization problem. That's like the magic combination to the biggest breaches that have happened in the last 5 years, right? So authorization, big one, this BOLA thing, and then traditional authorization, like do I have access to a specific operation? Again, this is all very specific of APIs because you have a single endpoint but different path. And I may have access to get on /foo, but I don't have access to post on /foo. Who's going to stop me, right? So authorization, authentication, and then the last one, which is big bulk, is data. So it's all about which data are you going to accept in and which data are you going to return out, right? Do you accept data you should not accept? Injection of data, for example. Are you leaking and returning much more than what you should? And the second one is really the critical one about APIs, because so this is like data leakage if you want. Because in many applications, what happens is you get you call an API, right? And because the providers of that API have no idea how that data is going to be consumed. Like whoever is going to call this API, are they going to need 3 properties out of that user, 10 or 100, right? So what do? Well, they return 100. That way, if somebody wants 3, they'll take 3. If they want 10, they'll take 10. They need all the 100, they'll take the whole 100. And then they rely on the client to filter that data. Back to our original point. So now, obviously, if I go straight to the API and circumvent the application, I don't see 3, I see 100. Am I authorized to see 100? Well, that's a different story, right? So that's the main three things of the top 10, right? Is how do we authorize access to operations, to specific resources, of course, how we authenticate, and then how we control data in and out. It's kind of the top 5 is what it is. That makes sense.
Yeah, on that last one, I think that's why we've seen such an emergence of GraphQL over the last few years, is the ability to just call for just specifically what you need out of the graph.
Yeah.
And it not sidesteps the problem, but it's an attempt to solve the problem of we've returned too many fields.
It has its own challenges of itself, but yeah.
Yeah,
Like
it's
then,
not a
then you need, because then you need to control what people are asking for, right? So in one sense, you need to control what you're actually returning, and the other way, you need to control what people are actually asking for, depending on who they are, right? So am I allowed to ask for 100 fields, or am I allowed to ask for 3 fields? Right? She's kind of, you gave the system much more flexibility. I totally agree in terms of asking only what you need, which, by the way, is also better from a performance point of view. It's like, why returning 100 fields when you only need 3? It's kind of, not very efficient. But on the other hand, it doesn't remove the problem or introduce a new problem, also in terms of authorization and making sure you're not asking more than what you're allowed, right? So you need some control there as well.
So thinking back to the bigger OWASP, the answer here, OWASP is awesome. We love OWASP around here. Is there anything, as somebody who works with API security day in, day out, is there anything you feel is like not on the list yet, or you see a trend that wasn't there when they first started making the list, or anything you just want a developer to know, like, hey, this is really important and it might not be on the list yet?
So actually, we got 2 versions of that list already. So we had the first one end of 2019, the first top 10 for APIs, and the second one was released at the beginning of this year, like around February 23 timeframe. And well, when something needs to get in, something needs to go out. So what happened in 2023 is SSRF entered the 2023 list as a new one, and also bots, entered, like automated attacks on APIs, which are not really about attacks in themselves in the sense of injecting malicious data, but more about abusing APIs. The typical example would be like an automated flow to, say, buy tickets for a concert, right? And some bot is basically abusing that by buying all the tickets for the next, big whatever Beyonce music show in a matter of seconds, and then those will be sold on black market or later, like 3 times or 4 times their price, right? So there's nothing wrong in how, I would say, in they're not stealing token or anything like this. It's all perfectly fine. They're paying, all good, but they were doing it in like machine time as opposed to human time, right? So this thing got in. There's like bot mitigation and protection also got in 2023, which is fine. But to your point, one of the big, I would say, discussion points of 2023 has been the removal of injection. So if you look at the API Top 10 2023, you will not find protection against injection. That used to be in the previous one. And that has stirred a lot of noise in the community. So, of course, injections problem is still there, more than probably, not more than ever, but they are there. So I would say across the board, as ever, input validation is your friend. We've been saying this for 20 years. Whatever you receive, as I always say, people, don't trust any piece of information that you receive. Test everything, control everything, and you will protect yourself from those data injections and insertions that we're talking about, or the traditional, SQL, NoSQL, etc., GraphQL, even injections that might be out there. So the big one, from a community perspective, which is missing, is something that clearly, spells injection.
Right. Yeah. It is interesting. I didn't realize that had been taken out. Where we're starting to wrap up now, and I'm conscious of your time. But before we close up, we always like to play a game with everyone called Best and Worst. And I'm always curious, what is the best security advice that you would give someone, or perhaps someone has given you over the years? And then what is the worst security advice that you've ever heard someone get? We'll start with the best, because that's typically a little bit easier.
Start with the best. Well, probably the one I just gave, I guess, which is, as I said, just validate everything and trust no one. I said, I'm not coming from a security world. I've learned over all the years to become paranoid about many different things. So I guess the key thing is this one. It doesn't really matter if the API you're working on is going to be consumed internally, externally, by partners. Of course, the risk is going to be different. The risk is always different depending on who the consumers are and where this is deployed. But just make it a practice to systematically validate everything that's coming your way. It's the access to, it's the data itself, but also the access to data. Whatever somebody's asking you to do, first validate if they actually have the right to do that and are sending you the proper data. That would be the main one, I think.
Fantastic. And have you ever heard any security advice that you wonder, what on earth are people thinking when they've said that?
Yeah. So then in that vein, the thing would be, don't worry about it because it's all internal. APIs. And I can give you, so that could be a great wrapper thing in story, right? This is a real story. I went to a prospect somewhere in the world without, so we don't find them. And those guys are the guys who are managing the little trucks that go from bank to bank and transport a lot of money. Okay. Well, it's gone, but there was at the time an internal API that would allow you to know at any point in time where those trucks were. And that API had zero protection. Anybody internal to the company could call that API and get the list of trucks and their geolocation. And people would say, well, that's okay, because we trust our employees. I'm like, in your field, I wouldn't do that. Right? So, yeah. That's
that was a fantastic one, actually. I love that, and that is a great story to finish up on. So I just wanted to say thank you, and to the listeners that want to learn more about 42 Crunch, then there's going to be show notes down below, so feel free to check that out and check out some of the great free tools that we've just mentioned here. Dwayne, I'll hand it over to you. Any final words before we click the big red button?
Just want to say thanks again for pushing out their API security. It's something I don't think enough people are thinking about. So really appreciate you, especially making tools available for developers to shift it left and to start testing earlier. And just all the content you have. Your blog is absolutely awesome. It's just a great set of resources for looking into this problem set. So thank you very much.
Thank you very much, and thanks for inviting us. And if you want to know more, you can go to apisecurity.io as well, which is our educational site for learning more about API security. No marketing. It's all about knowledge and sharing and educating.
Awesome. There'll be a link to that in the show notes as well for those wanting to. All right. Thanks so much, and we'll